So overall impressions of day two, white wines. Julia, you were overseeing the whole process. What do you reckon?
Coming first, okay. Very much like the reds. Overall, very high standard. Just looking at the number of medals, bronze, especially silvers, and a few golds. We know this competition has very high standards, so it's quite hard to find a gold medal. But overall, the numbers are there. So overall, it's been very positive.
Matteo, very high standards here at the IWSC, as Julia says. What's your sense?
Yeah, I completely agree. I think the standard were there in all the flights. A very interesting flight of Sauvignon Blanc from Styria. I think pretty much all the wines were above silver level, so which was very incredible to see that. Bacao, Bagram, and Camtal as expected, but they're definitely delivering.
There are some flights that only silver and golds, which is, we know the competition, know how hard it is. Usually you have bronze or no medal winners. So to see the flights full of silver and 2-3 golds, it shows how high it is.
Kat, I was judging with you, Kat. We had a sublime flight, didn't we?
We certainly did. So I would actually go as far as to say that today we enjoyed one of the best flights of white wine that we have judged professionally. It was a really fantastic flight of Grüne Veltliner, seriously delicious wines. Quality standards were really high across the board, but it was also just the capacity for aging, which I think that was the bit that really took us by surprise as a panel. And yeah, just fantastic to see.
Yeah, you hear so much about Grüne Veltliner's ability to age, but it was really sort of proof in the glass today, and that's something you've been banging on about for a long time, actually, isn't it?
Absolutely, yeah. I think that's something which is really exciting about Austrian white wines, dry white wines. You'll be hard-pressed to find a country that has such a great offering of good value, age-worthy dry white wines. And I think we saw a reflection of that in the wines today, which was really nice. We talk a lot about consistent, across the board, sort of high-quality bar with Austrian whites, and yeah, definitely got a sense of that for sure.
And what about you, Meg?
Oh, yeah, I mean, today was fantastic. I think it was probably one of the best days of judging that I've done. We had a lot of really high quality wines, of various different varieties, from Gruners, Chardonnays. We had some really lovely Rieslings as well at the end, so lots of silvers and a few golds as well. So it was really very positive.
So Matteo, which white grape variety impressed you most today?
I think definitely Sauvignon Blanc from Styria, as I was saying before. Top quality, those wines can rival easily Polyfumé or Sancerre region. I think they were delivering across the board.
Yeah. And what about you, Freddie? Because you're a renowned Grüne Veltliner fan.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, I've often been a little bit sceptical, and perhaps unfairly so, around some of the international grape varieties that are used in Austria. But today I was really impressed with the Pinot Blanc. Yeah. And I know it's a grape that has such a long history in Austria, so it's almost sort of been adopted as an indigenous variety. But in the past, I've been very much more drawn towards Grüne Veltliner in particular. But today we had some phenomenal Pinot Blanc. There was a small flight, but we had a couple of wines that did extremely well, and they were an absolute joy. They were just a sort of a masterpiece in texture, and it was really good to see. Yeah.
And Junior, you were there watching the results come in, like the Eurovision Song Contest. What's the sort of pattern? What are you seeing as the sort of most successful white grape varieties?
As Matteo mentioned, Sauvignon Blanc. There's a great flight of Sauvignon. There's a great flight of Rieslings, as you would expect, and obviously Grüne. So there was nothing really that surprised me, but just cemented what we all knew. Austria can make great wines, can make great white wines from those varieties which are indigenous to the place.
We enjoyed some successful Sauvignon Blanc, didn't we?
Yeah, we did, definitely. And I think the Sauvignons that we tasted were very definitely in a kind of lighter, greener, kind of elderflower style, which is actually relatively unique in terms of a flavour profile, and it's something that I think Austria could really build on. It's not the overblown, very kind of passion fruit driven tropical that is so popular at the moment. And I think for customers everywhere, it gives a really good and interesting alternative to a well-known style of wine.
Yeah.
So the perceived image of Austrian white wines in the UK at the moment, what would you say that is, Megan?
Yeah, I mean, I think as a whole, it's still a relatively unknown country for quite a lot of people, but it's definitely more known for the whites. So, people do, if they know about Austrian wines, they're obviously going to be thinking Grüne Veltliner. That's kind of your go-to. I think for some of the other varietals, probably not so much, and that's somewhere that people can hopefully really enjoy exploring and learning more about. And that's where something like this competition can be really useful to get that out to the market and get people learning a bit more about the region. Yeah.
What would you say, Freddie?
Yeah, I'd echo that. I think one thing which is still very much the case is it's an emerging region in the UK still. Grüne Veltliner is leading the way, I think, for the white wines. I think one thing that is very true is that it's, taking Grüne specifically, a style which the main challenge is getting it into people's glass. And there's been a number of times when I've recommended a Grüne Veltliner to somebody who even isn't necessarily an engaged wine enthusiast, but is a consumer. They taste it and they fall in love with it because it's such a generous and friendly style and it's so refreshing and it ticks so many boxes. So if we can keep capitalising on that, then great, and that perception is only going to continue.
Kat, would you agree?
Yeah, I think so. From my kind of perspective and my background in large-scale retail, I would say that the average UK consumer still isn't really very aware of Austria. So that is, again, an area of huge potential. And when you think that the majority of white wine styles that sell very strongly in the UK are aromatic, fresh, crisp, almost that sort of Sauvignon profile, you can see there's a natural fit really for Grüne Veltliner. There is a proportion of the UK off-trade customer who are more kind of wine conscious, wine aware, those sort of exploratory wine consumers who are in fact aware of Austria. So in their minds, Austria is very definitely associated with white wine, most definitely with Grüne Veltliner, and they associate it with those fresh, crunchy, bright, very juicy and easily drinkable wines.
I think one thing the country has in its favor, two things, is high standard, overall high standard, and consistency. You mentioned the success of New Zealand. Part of that is because of the consistency that the Sauvignon Blanc brings to the consumer. And the same thing is true to Grüne. I think there is that positive aspect. You pick a glass of Grüne, as you said, you give it to the consumer, they will enjoy it. And I think that's important to have high standard and to have consistency.
Matteo?
Well, I think in the image of Austrian white in high-end restaurant is very strong because those wines work very well with food. Also, sommelier really like those wines, and I'm sure that in all the top Michelin star restaurants there's always a white Austrian wine matched with food. So I would say for those top-end restaurants, definitely strong.
So from the consumer's perspective, where do we see the potential kind of areas of competition, I suppose, for Austrian white wines?
It's a really good question. I think there's a lot that Austrian whites have going in in their favour when it comes to actually reaching quite a mass market potentially. So we always see in the UK a particular style of white wine which is very, very popular and becomes a brand in itself. It's been something like Marlborough Sauvignon for quite a long time, Pinot Grigio perhaps a little bit before that. There's nothing about inexpensive Grüne which couldn't fit into that same sort of market area. You get a lot of wine for your money, a very friendly style of wine, very drinkable, very refreshing. And what I think is lovely is it can fit into quite a wide consumer space because stylistically, something like Grüne Veltliner can offer you whatever you're looking for. Whether you just want a really quick, refreshing glass of white wine, it's there. But if you want to look for a little bit more detail in the glass, a little bit more depth, often it offers that as well. So yeah, I mean, the opportunities in that sense are almost endless, but there's no reason why you wouldn't love Grüne if you've been a Marlborough Sauvignon fan or a Pinot Grigio fan or any other number of things, to be honest.
With your retail experience, Kat, what would you say on that? Go Grüne?
Absolutely. So in terms of thinking about this from a real kind of customer perspective and what people are looking for when they're shopping for wine, I see the opportunity for Austria, certainly within Grüne Veltliner, potentially with some of the Sauvignons. And the kind of the competitive set, I guess, really, for me, would be New Zealand as a country. Slightly more premium position in the market, which in terms of pricing is probably where Austria wants to be, rather than more entry point countries like sort of Chile or South Africa. Or having said that, though, actually there are some kind of new world regions, Casablanca, Lleida, kind of Elgin Sauvignon, where they are all renowned for being very aromatic and expressive grape varieties that are very fresh, very crisp. And I think there are definite kind of synergies really with Austrian wine. So I think there is an opportunity at a slightly sort of volume end, which would tackle the customer who loves a Marlborough Sauvignon, and then there are some slightly more niche but still interesting volume opportunities at those slightly more premium price points and those kind of regionally specific wines.
Junior?
If you look at what people are drinking in UK, you mentioned Sauvignon Blanc, and people are just picking up the shelf and being sort of price sensitive. Can Austria compete with that? It can, but I don't think it should. It should be more premium. It should be more focused on the on-trade. If people want the explosion tropical fruit from Sauvignon Blanc from a country, great. But I think Austria can deliver amazing subtleties and elegance and amazing personality. So go into a different sort of channel and look at the on-trade and look at different types of styles. And the same thing for red wines, what people picking up from the shelf today, Malbec. So can Zweigel, with that lovely, juicy, exuberant fruit, pick up some of that? I think it can, because it does offer, what does Malbec has? A lovely, juicy, exuberant fruit, softness, a balancing freshness, exactly what Zweigel can do. So yeah, it's exactly the same thing.
I think if you look at some of the wines that have been working particularly well in the UK on-trade recently, there's also opportunities where things like Picpoul de Pinet or Albarino, things which have got that kind of minerality to it. And you also get that with Grüne Veltliner.
You get that with
and
Grüne.
Also, because with both of those, there's been big price rises, there's been shortages of supply. This is where Grüne really has that opportunity to kind of step into those shoes. Not because it needs to step into other, a different variety of shoes, but it's got similar profiles, it's got that minerality, it's got that character, it's got that personality. All things that have been really well received in the UK on-trade. And I think just once people know more about it and it's a bit more accessible, then it can really fly.
Yeah, Picpoul's a great point actually, because it's understood, it's popular, but it's relatively scarce and it's shot up in price. So great.
But David, that's we're talking about premium. And one of the things, looking at the results today, a lot of the wines that did well, they are wines that have age in the bottle. So you mentioned Albarino, and Grüne is the same thing. It can age in the bottle. You can actually sell at a premium, which is another thing, especially for the on-trade. You need to add value. You don't want to be fighting on price. Most of the Austrian producers are small holdings, premium, focus on quality. So one of the opportunities to be patient and sell wines with a little bit more bottle age.
But I agree with that. I think, though, one of the strengths of Austrian white wines is the value that they can offer at the entry point as well. Because, it's a lot to ask a consumer in the UK to go straight into a premium Austrian wine if they've never had an Austrian wine before. And yes, the complexity that's possible at the top end is unbelievable. Right. But let's not forget that there are a lot of these wines at the entry level which can offer so much value for money.
The standards are high. Yes,
absolutely.
And at the other end, lists don't come much more premium than yours, Matteo. So where's the area of potential opportunity competition?
I think perhaps is more with German wines, Galician wine, and also Italian white varieties. I think for me those are the three more competitors in the high-end restaurant. But again, I think every single country has its own place. It's not that necessarily one would go in terms of style. It's just if tonight you want Austrian varieties, you go for it, or maybe because match better with the food. So I don't see much of a competition in this high-end restaurant.
I think that's the important point. Important thing you just said. Every country has its own place. I mean, the important thing is for Austrian producers not to mimic Sauvignon Blanc, not to mimic Albarino, is to be, do what they do best without trying to copy anyone.
Proudly Austrian.
Be proudly Austrian.
What's the message then for producers looking to improve their white wines from Austria? Freddie, you first.
It's a good one. It's a tough one, but I think really it goes for anywhere. Get it right in the vineyard. Always get it right in the vineyard. Austria is already doing a fantastic job in that sense because we know how well they do with organic viticulture in particular. But healthy fruit and then trying to preserve what you gain in the fruit in the vineyard in your winemaking, I think is so important. So one thing that really stands out about the great examples of Austrian white for me is this certain energy, this lift, this vibrancy, and this precision that they have. And that all comes through great healthy fruit, picking at the right time, and not messing around with it too much in the winery, not over oaking it, and, not doing too much lees work. Just preserving what nature gives, I think, is number one.
About you?
Yeah, I mean, very similar. I think talking about oak is quite important, possibly more so with the reds that we tasted yesterday. We mentioned it. Sometimes the oak was actually masking some of those kind of the purity of the fruit and the real characteristics that are more expressive of the area. And I think that's really what you want in the wine. You want to have those classic kind of characters, and you don't want anything to detract from that. So I think just those kind of careful considerations with the winemaking is very important.
And those considerations were, definitely true of a few of the wines that we tasted today, Kat.
Yeah, so I think, I'm not in any way knocking the overall quality level of what we tasted, because it has been a superb day of tasting white wine today. But there were a number of examples which didn't quite perform as well, where there was probably more intervention in the winery. So we had a number of wines which were very obviously very cold fermentation. So we had a lot of pear drop and kind of banana notes, which, to your point, Megan, really just detracted from the prettiness and purity of the fruit. And then we also had some Chardonnays which have been quite heavily oaked, obviously trying to maintain and kind of meet a very international style. So it was just quite hard to understand as judges how that wine was Austrian rather than, a generic Chardonnay from around the world. So I think, in summary, the best wines today really just sang of their place and the great variety in combination, and there hadn't been too much interference or meddling from a kind of winery winemaking point of view.
I think if I could just add something to that as well, one thing that I would really encourage, especially younger Austrian winemakers, to do is travel. Go and work in other wineries around the world. Go and pick up tips from what they're doing. But also, it's not necessarily about mimicking those tips, those tricks, like for like, but just using them to really magnify what it is that makes Austrian terroir particularly special. But the best thing that people can do to improve the quality is get out there, go and see other people in other well-known wine regions and learn and absorb.
If not, when they're traveling, just taste a lot of different wines. It's quite important. As you said, Freddie, don't be over-ambitious in terms of yield. Bring down the yield. Bring down the yield. And one of the biggest issues, especially with some varieties like Chardonnay, it's the misuse of oak. That was one of the biggest problems we've seen today.
So the calling cards for Austria then, tricky question, but what do you think they are, Kat?
Oh, thanks. So, leaping in, I think I would probably pick out two. For me, the first one would definitely be freshness. And I use the term freshness, not acidity, because freshness is much, much more customer friendly. If you talk about acid in wines, a lot of consumers will look panicked.
Acid equals bad thing when it's not.
When actually it's delicious.
Very true.
So freshness, really, for me, is one of the absolute hallmarks of Austrian wine. It means that the wines are, even if they're very concentrated, very dense in terms of flavour, you still want to return and have a second glass because they are just deliciously drinkable. And that, as a hallmark, is actually very commercial, because you've got consumers with a wet appetite for your wines who will go back to the bottle and have another glass. That's what everyone should be aiming for. And then I think the second one really for me would be the indigenous grape varieties. There is so much potential, there are so many stories, and there's so much that's unique to Austrian wine that means it should and it does deserve its own place in export markets.
Difficult to argue with those calling cards, but anyone want to add anything else in terms of a calling card for Austrian white wine?
No, I think we're
good with it. Perhaps texture, because the texture of these wines is unique. Freshness, perhaps, surely you can find also in other varieties in other countries, but the texture, the density, the concentration of fruit that these wines have is probably incredible.
The consistency is there, the high standard is there, freshness is there. So there's a lot to talk about.
I think from my perspective, I might just add openness as well, because it's a very, very, because of some of the challenges of the past, it's a very, very open wine producing country. It is possible to find absolutely everything about these wines. The traceability is superb. The information that's available to the wine enthusiast, to the consumer, to the journalist, to the retailer, whoever. I think it's really admirable, and they should really keep up with that openness. I think.
I completely agree with the ones that have already been mentioned. I think in particular the indigenous varieties. I'd also add the sustainability thing. Austria does such a great job in that respect, and that's something which is only going to become more significant for the consumer. Certainly in the UK, we're seeing that already, and Austria is in such a strong position currently. Going into doubtless a time period when the consumer is only going to become more and more sensitive to that sort of thing. There aren't many countries in the world that have a better starting point.
I find also the wineries I visit in Austria, they're all quite young winemakers. They are very dynamic. So just as you say, carry on traveling, carry on learning, and carry on lifting the standards.
Absolutely.
It's very simple.
So what's the message then for getting a wine listed in the UK for an Austrian producer who's looking to do that? What about you, Megan?
Well, I guess communication is key. So communicating out, like we've mentioned, all the sustainability, that has become so hugely important for the customer base that I work with. We work with predominantly the on-trade, but also lots of corporate catering and hospitality and events. And sustainability is like the key buzzword at the moment. Everything has to be sustainable. The more sustainable things that you can kind of list off, the better. So communication of that is really very important. And for a country that is kind of at the forefront of it, I don't think that's been communicated about enough yet. I certainly didn't know the extent of the sustainable aspects in this country until this trip, and Junior explained it to me. So I think that's definitely key. As we were saying with the calling cards, those indigenous varieties, and some of the wines we've tasted in the last couple of days have been fantastic and really hit those parts in the market that are really popular at the moment. So chillable light reds or mineral styles or zesty fresh whites. So just trying to communicate that out with the wider market, and attending tastings and submitting samples. Wine Austria is a fantastic resource as well.
That's so true.
The website and everything is great. So it's really just about getting that message out there, and I'm sure it will come.
I think one other thing that's really important is if you want to export, you've got to be serious about it, because it's not necessarily easy. You're going to have to plug away at it for quite a while. There's a huge amount of competition, especially if you're exporting to somewhere like the UK, which is an incredibly competitive market. You've got to be serious about it. It's not necessarily something that will work if you just think, I wouldn't mind exporting a bit of wine. That would be nice. Because you will have to make some sacrifices. There will be things like spending time in the market, which will make a big difference. You might have to sell at a slightly lower price than you would locally, let's say. You've got to be willing to make those sorts of sacrifices. So if you want to export, you've got to be prepared to really go for it, take it seriously and do it properly.
And the wines are special, but there are a lot of special wines in the world. So Kat, what would you say to a producer in terms of advice?
I'm very glad you used the word special, because that was going to be a key part of my reply. I think the absolute key when you're approaching a new export market is to understand what it is about your wine specifically that is special and different from anybody else's. Ultimately, you need to be able to convince a buyer that you know the answer to the question, what is my wine giving a consumer that no other wine can? So it's basically about identifying your unique selling point. If you've got that, and that's at the heart of everything you do, it's integral to your packaging, to your labeling, you are already priming yourself for a very successful conversation with a buyer. It's so easy for a producer to almost take their own wines for granted, so that they just present it to you as this is the wine we've been making forever. Okay, so what does that mean for a customer, and why, if a customer is standing in a supermarket environment, for example, with 900 wines on the shelves around them, why are they going to pick your wine? And if you can't articulate that, you will not break into an export market.
That's a really good point.
Great point.
Just to add to that as well, from the point of view of a buyer, the times when people have been most successful in approaching me about listing their wines is when they've taken the time to look at what we sell already and spot a gap. and go, well, I make X style of wine and I notice that you don't currently list X style of wine, therefore, and immediately as a buyer it makes you think, okay, yes. And also over and above thinking, well, yes, that is a gap in our range. From my point of view, it makes me realize that they're willing to do the homework. You know, they're willing to make the effort.
To add value to your business.
Exactly, precisely, yeah.
Know what you've got.
Yeah, it's how you're supporting the buyer to do a better
Know
job.
who you're talking to, basically. Junior?
There's nothing to add. I mean, talking about if you achieve the silver medal at such an important competition, that means your wines are standing out. They are textbook examples. So there are many wines like that. We've seen it today. So as you said, Kat, what else is there? What is your USP, and what is your storytelling? So it's part of what's in the glass. Part of it's what you're storytelling, and the other part is to make the job of the buyer, as you said, easier. So it's a combination of factors, and then you have to go and spend time and invest time in the market. So it's not as easy as people think, and it's not as quick as people would like.
But it's worth it in the long run.
It's worth it.